Hi, I am author JH Sanderson. I am the creator of the Roadhouse Sun series of spy novels. That series was really creative and challenging because it starts out in an alternative history and it ends up at the end of the story arc in real time. Originally set in 1978, it ends up in 2001, and it kind of explains in an alternative fashion how things are the way they are. And that particular novel series centers around the Roadhouse Suns, which are a New England cover band that are recruited into the world of espionage against their will. How can that happen, you ask? Well, if you're familiar with the movie Red Dawn, starring Patrick Swayze and Jennifer Grey, then you're familiar with all of the areas in an alternative history where the US and Soviet Union go to war that are occupied by the Russians. This series of novels takes place in all of the areas that are not occupied, and it deals with how they're handling the Third World War. In that series of novels, they were initially recruited to help the FBI monitor the black market trade in various clubs and entertainment venues. And in the process, they go on and they uncover a Soviet mole. Then they uncover that a member of their band actually has a personal connection with this. And all of a sudden, they go from being assets and informants to being real spies. I'm not going to tell you any more because then why would you buy the book? But in addition to that, I had a while back wrote a novel based upon a haunted house that I had some experience with. That was my first foray into writing, mostly to see if I could discipline myself to sit at a keyboard every day and bang out a manuscript. And happy to say I was able to pull that off. In addition to those, I wrote an anecdotal history of my hometown in Vermont. The European branch of my mother's family moved up to that area around 1790 and stayed. I can stand in the Eastburg Cemetery and count about 7 generations. One of the things that I was surrounded by growing up in Northeastern Vermont were the very skilled raconteurs or storytellers. And I'm not talking about the ones that will sit down, as you're getting ready for bed and say, once upon a time, and so on and on. I'm talking about the ones that can look at a spot, hear a name, participate in an event, and give you a whole history of it. Not some boring on this date in 1722 or 1865 or 1904, but talk about, well, I remember hearing about when so-and-so showed up and started, living here. And they will share events about the person's life. Not what they did, but why they did it. And in working on a town history project when I was in high school, everybody wanted to know, well, when was the first shingle mill built? When was the first sawmill built? When was the first house built? When was the first settler arrive? And that was fine because I gave you reference points. But one of the things that I was intrigued with was, how did these people live? What did they do? What were the events that shaped their life? What challenges did they face? How did they respond to it? Finding out how the families, the ancestors of very prominent families, dealt with some not so prominent situations was pretty inspiring. How one leading family, the Darlings, how they arrived in this country back in the 1600s as prisoners of war. Having supported the wrong side during the English Civil War, when the parliamentarians and Cromwell and the Puritans took over, they had all of these royalists and people loyal to the crown that they had to get rid of. So they shipped them off to the New World. Specifically, a lot of them ended up working in the Saugus Iron Works, 6 days a week, from sunup to sundown, pounding heavy hammers, working with the iron, and a lot of them would be severely injured, they would be deaf, but they had a sentence to fulfill. And when they got done, they stayed. Well, eventually the descendants of those people moved up to Burke And if you ever go through the Burke-Linden area, you will find the Darling Inn. You will find Lindbergh Hall, also known as Darling Manor. You will find all sorts of things associated with Elmer and Lucius Darling, who were very wealthy individuals through restaurants and farming and management and so forth. And they left quite an impact on the community that's felt even to this day. But I would hear about their stories, and I would hear about other leading families that, their first winter there, they were faced with starvation, and they didn't know what to do. And while the husband would be out in the woods trying to find any particular game, the mother would be digging through the snow and chopping up the ground to dig up seed potatoes to feed the family. And I would find stories like that. And one gentleman, Alonzo Farmer, in the 1850s, he decided he wanted to go make his fortune in the California minefields. And so he picked up, sold all his stuff, and took part in the Sacramento Trail. And if you have a chance to read his diary and hear the stories about him, it's like reading a Zane Grey novel. And so I very quickly became infatuated by the fact that everything and everyone has a story, and I wanted to find a way to tell those stories. And so eventually I just sat down and I started writing them out. And when I had stories that I wanted to tell, I had all sorts of information and examples and materials to draw from to help me do that. And that is one of the reasons that I really love being an author, and I really want to share these little videos with people that also have told me every time I talk about them and I talk about my books, they tell me, I'd like to write a book someday. One of these days I would probably do it. And okay, stick around and I'll give you a few pointers.